So we'll get going.
Cool.
Tell me your name.
I'm Andrew Quitmeyer. Do you want me to talk to you or to the camera?
You can talk to me. That's
okay. Perfect. Okay, I'm Andrew Quitmeyer.
And Andrew, where are you from? What do you say when people ask you where you're from?
It really depends on who's asking me. I kind of couch it in different things, depending on like if people know where St. Louis is. But I'm from near St. Louis in Illinois, and so I grew up in the Midwest, and then I moved to China for a little bit, and then I moved to Atlanta, Georgia in the U.S. To do my PhD, and now I live in Singapore.
Great. And Andy, what kind of things do you make?
The things that I try to make are interactive devices for playing with nature and animals. That's kind of my big goal. I kind of feel like I don't get to make those as much as I want to, but that's the thing I really strive to make. What I end up doing, what I kind of feel I end up making a lot is infrastructure to lead up to how to make these interactive devices for playing with animals and nature. So like things like backpacks and ways of carrying tools out to the jungle, things like I make like conferences and expeditions to get people out into cool natural places so that they can make things like that. And so I find myself actually doing a lot more of this like meta infrastructure work of getting people to make these devices and explore nature and technology at the same time. But I always secretly kind of am like, ooh, I just want to sneak away and make some sort of, ant board game that the ants can play with each other.
Ants and eating ants. I think you need a pineapple.
Ah, thank you.
Interview break.
You take it.
yeah. So you holding?
No,
Okay.
I was going to say.
I'm all set. Okay. Thank you.
Cool. Pineapple.
Pineapple. All right. Pineapple break. So when there's going to be a lot of questions about making. And
Okay.
You can answer them any way you would like.
Okay.
I'm going to want to focus on when you're making directly as opposed to organizing a conference. But
Okay.
But if it comes in about...
Oh, no. Perfect. Okay.
So, where do you do... This is a good question for you. Where do you do the making that you do?
When I'm making something, I try to do it as close to the place that it's going to be used as possible. I used to make a lot more things, electronics, different interactive devices in like kind of regular laboratories, places where you have a computer, a nice lab bench or something, soldering irons hooked up. But it kind of sealed me off from the outside world. It made me I get all antsy after a while. I'm the kind of person who needs to run around in the forest a lot and be in nature, and it made me kind of feel cooped up if I'd have to spend like 6 hours like inside while I know that the sun's out and there's people are riding bikes around and playing outside and looking at birds or whatever. And so that was the first part that started me kind of moving my sight of making stuff out into the world, the kind of more natural world. And then the second part is I started noticing whenever we're building stuff in an environment that's very different from where the thing's actually going to be used, you end up incorporating all these assumptions in your head that aren't necessarily true about how... You end up incorporating a lot of assumptions that might not be true about how these environments that you're designing for actually work. You just kind of forget about things. You make this thing, you spend tons of time on it, and you bring it outside and you realize like, oh, it's not always 76 degrees Fahrenheit in the jungle, and thus my thing got all cloudy and broke or corroded. Or, oh, this thing's supposed to be on a ship going around the sea, and any bits of metal that are exposed get corroded instantly just by the salty wind. And so for me, I found making to be kind of a good way to explore a new environment. And by making in the environment, you can also explore the technology itself and really understand your design problem that you're working with. It can be a lot harder. There's a lot of times where you're like in a rainstorm under a tarp huddled, and you just have your headlamp and you're trying to get this thing soldered. Not maybe the ideal situation for like doing very fine finesse type of electronics work, but it definitely keeps you right on target.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's great. Do you know why you make things? And it's okay if you don't. People sometimes don't, but...
Yeah. I think I make things because I have an obsession with novelty. If I think of something and I'm like, that doesn't exist yet, I get kind of an urge of just like, well, shit, nobody's gonna make this board game for ants. So I guess I have to do it. And then I guess I feel like a weird little personal responsibility, and maybe I get all existential. I'm just like, in the history of man, no one will know if we can make this board game that ants can play with each other, unless I do it right now. And then I get kind of like this impetus going, and okay, and now I try to whip stuff together until somehow I've satiated that urge a little bit, and I've made something, and then felt like it's like some kind of new thing that has added to the world. And of course, this doesn't have to be new as in like, oh, this is brand new, nobody's ever thought of this, but you know, in the way that is a really cool bug. But new in the way that every time anyone makes something, it's new, it's fitted to some sort of different context, to their own life, they've brought this out in a different weird way. But yeah, something that's new and kind of novel that maybe the world hasn't quite seen yet, and I wish that they could see.
You've already touched on a couple things, but tell me some more of the benefits of making things from your own view, for yourself. What are the benefits?
Mm-hmm. I think.
And these can be large and small.
Yeah. I mean, for me, one of the real benefits of making different stuff is you instantly know how the thing works once you can actually make it. And then you can modify it, you can repair it. Your world starts to begin looking a lot more plastic. You can see things not as these static objects of like, oh, I guess that's how that thing always is, but like, oh, okay, that thing's kind of wonky. We could add this and we make it glow, and now it runs around on its own. Okay, cool. And so you begin to kind of take a bit more of an active role in your relationship with especially technological artifacts, different tools that we may have. Before you're able to make these, it seems a lot more daunting. How could I ever make a backpack, for instance? Those are things you just buy. They have nice comfy straps, and it's like, okay, but now I kind of figured out like, this is how we can sew it, this is how we can make it a little more comfortable, and oh, my backpack always pinched me here, but now I can add in my own customized straps and things like that. And I think, yeah, there's basic customization, so you can like change things to fit your own needs. But I think for me, maybe the more important thing is being able to see how these systems work and being able to see how things can change, and how you can manipulate them, and how there's these weird power structures that do exist that try to keep you from changing things, or, you know, obscuring information about exactly how to do this kind of thing. So it's very, very eye-opening to see the structures of technology and the structures of culture at the same time.
What do you learn when you're making? And if you have examples, that would be great.
Mm-hmm.
Things that you learn during the making process.
Yeah. I think when I first started with electronics kinds of making projects, one of the first things that I really learned was how lenient some electrical things can be. Especially from like studying electronics in university and in high school, and you know, oh, here are these different laws and here's how these things work, and you learn everything in a very ideal kind of way. But then when I'm sitting there, especially in a very resource limited area like a jungle or forest or something, and I'm just like, I know this thing says it's 3 volts, but what's going to happen if I get it 5? And I end up being surprised by what things I can kind of underclock, overclock, mod out in really hacky ways that I'm like, oh, this really shouldn't work. And then I also end up also surprised by things that are less robust than I might think. Like, oh, and this thing says it needs 5 volts. It needs 5 volts. You do not give it 5.3 or, blue smoke comes out. And so you kind of, that's I think one of the most surprising things for me personally is how hacky you can actually get with different things. Yeah. So that's one thing that I learned from making. Should I do more?
Yeah, if you have another, and I'm very interested also in the kind of things that relate to making from the outside. So, obviously we know in the process that we learn certain things about the process itself, but I'm interested in hearing you talk a little about what else you explore through that process, and what other things that are peripheral or in the ecosystem of making.
I think one of the biggest things for me when I'm making things. Pineapple. I think one of the biggest things that I learned from making stuff is a real patience for things. If I get really into a project, I might be sitting there poking and prodding for hours and hours and having to wait through the sequence to see how this kind of thing tests and runs. For instance, I was trying to re-emulate this paper by these people who made their own silly putty and doped it with graphene to make these really sensitive sensors that could sense spiders walking on top of them. I thought this would be great, especially if we get it even more sensitive to have it detect tiny ants walking on top of it. And so I spent a good 2 months buying different types of silly putty, getting different types of graphene that I could order online, figuring out ways, because I don't have like a nanotechnology, workshop. I just have my lab bench at home, but I really wanted to unlock this potential power of these really cool ultra-sensitive sensors for myself to study ants, for scientists who might want to study ants or other small insects, and then just for like common folks who, okay, I can order these 2 things off of Amazon and mix them together with some acetone and now they work. But this took just endless days. I would wake up early, I would search for tinier and tinier hairs that I could poke and prod this thing with, and I would do like series of like, okay, I'm going to poke it like this, then I'm going to poke it with 2 hairs, then I'm going to poke it with 3 hairs, and just like studying different curves and data that I collect with it, and then try out a whole new mixture of the graphene silly putty stuff and figure out where I went wrong and why it isn't conducting soon and stuff like that. And it's incredibly tiring, and it's one of those things that when you really get into it, you kind of see the sun go up and then down and just kind of pass you by, and then suddenly it's night again and you're just like, oh, I need to eat, but it gives you this kind of patience. I go back and forth between whether I like this or not, whether it's unhealthy to obsess about something, but it can definitely be useful to learn patience with these kinds of things. And I know my wife, once remarked about how she was getting frustrated with doing some kind of project, and then she remembered me sitting there for months on end slowly poking goo every morning, and was like, okay, yeah, I guess you're used to frustration. Yeah, sure.
Sorry for turning this into a media studio.
You know what? I have a strong opinions on making. Oh, hold on.
After. Thank you.
We can wait for the motorcycle to go by too if you want.
Yeah.
Are you running out of time?
Not at all.
Oh, okay, cool. Oh, no.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
This is the main challenge here, though. It's
Yeah.
how do I get a space that looks good and on the podcast and stuff. Okay.
This is why we escape to the boat to do the podcast too sometimes.
Yeah, I was thinking of doing it in my cabin, but anyway, they're fine. Where were we? So those are great examples. Tell me some of the, and I'm guessing there are many, of the disciplines or practices or areas of study that your making touches.
So I think in terms of the different disciplines that the stuff that I make touches, first it's a lot of basic electronics engineering and computer programming, and I try to see those as, I'm not very much married to those specific disciplines. My work is a lot more about interactions with different kinds of creatures and natural things that are alien to us. I like exploring all the aliens that live just right nearby, that we have no way of really engaging with. And for right now, we have this cool digital technology that lets us give robots and electronics these behaviors. And these behaviors let you, take in information, give information back out, and interact with things in ways we couldn't previously, and dynamically interact with them. And so that tends to use a lot of digital technology and electronics technology, because that's kind of what we have that's able to do these behaviors right now. But I could see in the future, having things like, synthetic biology that I could program in similar ways to do my interaction design work. But so maybe those disciplines could be more, summed up in more like interaction design, if anything. But then the other disciplines that I use a lot tend to be filmmaking and performance, because I'm doing these projects that are often time-based. They're somewhat character-based. You're having interactions between different things. My previous training and skills and obsession with filmmaking, it ends up being very useful, because you can capture moments and interactions and tell narratives about how your project works, about how it interacts with nature, about what the functions of the things that you may do, how you can build them yourself, and you can try to sum them up very quickly and easily to make them accessible for people. So that's a field that I rely on very heavily, and why one of the most important things for me at the conference is having a strong documentation team. Not only for us at the conference, but made available for the people at the conference, so that they can have assistants documenting their own projects in various different media format ways. And then probably the final discipline that I use often, kind of beyond this, is maybe performance art. It's, at the end of the day, it ends up being a big exercise in creating these weird things, showing people how to make these weird things, and somewhat coercing people that making weird things is a good, fruitful thing, which I think it is, and I do believe that making strange, new, weird stuff is great, but the general narrative in a lot of societies is that unless you're adding to production and increasing efficiency, things aren't necessarily worthwhile endeavors. So I try to use performative aspects of things like throwing a giant weird conference, or running around and demoing stuff, or having an interactive installation somewhere to engage people in different ways. So that's the kind of final part, engaging people about all of this work.
Great, thank you. Those are terrific answers. What is making good for? What are the benefits?
I feel like it can be bad for posture. I'm trying to get out the bad things first. I get kind of hunched over. If you get obsessed and you're making something, you might I'm like, I need to go stretch. But I think it can be I think it's good for a lot of things I kind of previously mentioned, just about being able to understand the things that you might commonly use every day, being able to understand how you can change and modify stuff. I think it's also, maybe another thing I didn't mention, I think it's a useful way to share experiences with people. Some people like to talk to each other, or go to movies together, or have a picnic or something, and I like all of those things. But some people really enjoy making things for people or making things with people, and it's another type of engagement that you can have. Making can be a very social thing, even if not even necessarily considered like you're doing it in a very social way. Maybe I've worked with lots of people who, we had a great time, both hunkered over in our own corners, making little things, not even necessarily chatting with each other that much, but then maybe at the end of the day just showing this beautiful thing that people have made. And that's something that's really cool here at Dinacon, is there's always people making and crafting different stuff. And people all have very different styles of working. Some people are working together. Some people will go off into the jungle on their own for hours, but then they'll come back and you'll see all of this cool stuff that they made, and it just kind of, explodes, and it's very interesting. So maybe I think it's a good way for some people to share experiences of life and being with each other.
Yeah, I think that's really true. There's a huge social aspect. How does making make you feel?
It depends. It can be frustrating. It depends how much energy I have left over. I have a good amount of energy in general. But then sometimes when a project gets below a certain threshold, it can just be kind of frustrating, and then I have to set it aside and just disappear from it and just run around, swim, something that lets it diffuse out of me. Stop making. Being able to stop yourself from making is also, I think, an important part of making stuff. Giving yourself some time to breathe and almost start getting bored, so that then you're eager to jump back into crafting or doing something, when previously you got all pissed off because the sewing machine elastic keeps getting bunched up and you're angry at it. But then other times, when it's not frustrating, or you're trying to escape from it, or just need some separation from it, I think it makes me feel just kind of I think there's two other modes that I'll go into when I'm making something, and there's three total maybe. Frustration, this thing's bunching up, or the material's not behaving the way I want it. So frustration's one, but then the other two are more positive. One is just really excited, and I'm just super eager to I know exactly how this thing will go here, and I'll get this, and then suddenly this weird new thing will happen, and I'm excited and curious to kind of find out what's going to happen next. And then the third type of feeling that I'll have is usually more of just a Zen kind of state, kind of mindless state. You're just in it, you're flowing with the material. You're not necessarily all jumping off the walls about how great this thing's gonna be. You're not necessarily all super bummed because you're trying to make this square and it's coming out very trapezoidal and round in parts. And but instead you're just kind of going with the material, and you're just kind of you're zoned into the things, and almost mindless. You're outside of your own mind.
Right, flow state.
Yeah.
Yeah. I recognize all three of those, but especially that flow state, and it the frustration tends to work against it.
Yeah.
You go back and forth between the two. It's a very familiar feeling. Twice. Okay. So here's one that I believe you'll be able to tell us something about.
Okay.
In your making process, where have you traveled? Where has making enabled your travel to?
I've gone all over the place by now.
Tell us some of the places you've been for making.
Yeah, for making stuff.
Where are we?
Yeah, well, right now we're in Thailand on a little island off of Phuket that has a small local population, but then is mostly just kind of a wild, overgrown rubber tree plantation. And so it's a beautiful, cool place full of vibrant creatures doing all kinds of different stuff, and they're just very much around and interacting with each other, and it makes me just super incredibly happy. So this is the most recent place. One of the places I really started making stuff out in the wild was probably in Panama. I did a lot of my PhD research down there, and at the Smithsonian has this tropical field station. And before I got into this, I didn't even know that there were these like tropical field stations that feel like a James Bond supervillain hideout, all these scientists running around in the jungle. And so I got to like hang out there, and you got to meet all these people who have, jobs that I didn't even know existed. There's people studying cancer in wild animals. So they're like an oncologist, but they're also a field biologist at the same time. And there's these whole ways of living you get exposed to that I wouldn't have known about. So there's Panama, there's Thailand, I went to this great conference in Ghana in Africa recently, and we got to hold part of the conference in a kind of national park that had 400,000 straw-colored fruit bats hanging over us. And these are giant, giant bats. And we had to deal with a little bit of the guano rain coming down on us. But it was, again, another magical place full of strange, wonderful alien creatures just carrying on life, and abundance are all around. The Philippines, worked in a place called Dumaguete, this little coastal village south of it called Banilad, to make this floating bamboo makerspace. I've been throughout China a little bit. Then I was doing less physical computing stuff and more animation, storytelling kind of workshops with people. Same as in Ecuador and the Galapagos. Where else?
Have you been anywhere cold?
I tend to avoid the cold, but I kind of want to start exploring cold places more. I would love to go to Antarctica and try out this. In the silly TV show, I did 2 episodes up in Alaska, and that was kind of my first time making stuff where it was really cold. And because I have such a fondness for the tropics and for lush biodiversity just oozing out of every crack, I thought that I was gonna like hate Alaska and be like, oh, this is boring, it's just ice everywhere. But it's its whole own thing, and it's got its whole own aesthetics, and it's incredibly big, and so that was really neat. And all the challenges were different and new and flipped around a lot about what I could do and what I couldn't normally do. And so that was cool. I would like to explore cold places more a little bit. I think that would be neat. Yeah.
What do you notice better through making?
So that's why, it's important to go to research where to question.
I tend to notice when I'm making stuff, especially like electronic stuff, I tend to notice details on common objects that I might otherwise ignore. Like, now I know what all the fine text on, DC adapters that plug into walls that power all your devices, I kind of like understand what that means, and what it means that this one's 5 volt 2 amps and this one's 5 volt 500 milliamps or something like that, and that the different ways I can use them, change things around with that, and how things might be able to be connected to each other. That, this thing came with this device, but I can also still use it with this other device. But I think I only noticed that because of when I was making, I needed these very particular requirements to do something. And then the other thing that I notice when I'm making stuff is, I guess, maybe more industrial design of things, and that tends to be something that I really take for granted. Even things like this box that I'm using for a project, and once I've made it, I pay much more attention to how well that box keeps working in the future. Like, oh man, this one time I made this great box for this thing. It was like 10 years ago, and I've just drug it through the jungle, and it's lived on. Versus like other times I'll make this other type of box or whatever, and like it just keeps breaking, and I'm having to repair it. Something like my shorts. I wouldn't have noticed the first time that it ripped just how I have this weird tension spot. The way that these, just mostly the right leg works, it makes this tension spot that no matter how many times I repair a different strip, it'll put the pressure somewhere else and break right open. And for some reason, the pants aren't like that on the left side of the leg. So I think they tailored the right leg like a little smaller, or maybe my right leg is just oddly bigger or something. But that's something I would not have noticed at all if I hadn't been repairing and making my own version of the pants constantly. I probably would have just thrown them away.
Yeah, you really, I find the making process, you really get into this like fractal level of detail sometimes. You can go as deep as you want. And that keeps me off and in the flow state, that I can get more and more focused. So I definitely recognize that. Has making helped you collaborate?
Yeah, definitely.
Tell me about that.
I tend to work on a lot of projects individually. I might go shut off the inverter real quick, just because. Or Grace.
Wait.
Oh, okay. I think our inverter is being weird.
Oh.
You hear this?
There we go. Yeah, I think someone just has something plugged into it that's overloading it.
I wonder what it is.
We can just leave it off for a little bit, let it charge up or something.
It settled down.
Cool.
Yeah. All right, we'll leave it off a little bit. Hopefully it won't make people too crazy. I thought it was a bird. There's so many different kinds. Like, wow, that's a really interesting and slightly annoying animal.
Well, since I set that thing up, I've noticed it a lot more than I think a lot of people do. I'm like, I can hear that thing from over at the kitchen. I'm like, I know that tone.
Yeah. Actually, what do you notice when you're making? A lot of annoying beeping.
Yes, exactly.
So, tell me about collaboration.
Yeah, collabing. I tend to be the kind of person who works alone a lot. And mostly because I work really fast and I get an idea in my head and it's more like I just need to get it done and then I can move on to the next thing, and not necessarily, I'm not the kind of person who really simmers on an idea or finds that enjoyable. A lot of people do. They kind of like thinking about this project and different ways that it could go. For me, it's a bit more of like I just got to get it out of me kind of thing. And so I tend to work very fast and not necessarily with people a lot because they might move at a different pace than me. They might have other project ideas or something, and I just might not be that interested. So I tend to be a bit more a lone wolf. But it gets lonely being a lone wolf, and And when you're sitting for 2 months just poking goo by yourself, you start thinking a little bit in the back, like, maybe this would be more fun to do with somebody else instead of just lonely goo poking. And which can be useful too, but I think that kind of making has kind of gotten me to start thinking and strategizing how I can use my own impulses and styles of doing things, but maybe with other people and collaborating with them on things. And then you also just run into all the things that you can't make, or you get really frustrated and you're like, I suck at sewing this. But then you collaborate a little bit on a project with a friend, like my friend Hannah, who's awesome at sewing stuff together. And she shows me all these amazing tricks, like, if you actually reverse over this thing, it goes a lot smoother first. And it's like, oh, okay, great. And so those kind of frustrations can lead into a lot of collaboration. And I found those very rewarding. But it starts with, I guess for me, having to be frustrated kind of first, or just having something that's I know is a little bit beyond me, and then spurring on the collaboration.
Yeah, and now of course the collaboration is not the only social element. You also do a lot of what I guess I would think of as leadership kind of things, creating stuff and teaching, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Have you grown in that way? Tell me something about that, how leadership and making work together for you.
I think maybe the leadership and making stuff for me is just another layer of having this thing in my head, this idea in my head that I just want to see out in the world. And I'll go and try to do it myself, but then like all my energy's like depleted, and then I realize like, wow, I used a lot of energy there. I actually want this thing to happen. I'm gonna need like 100 people to like spend all their energy on it, and realistically that's gonna mean like 500 people spending a little bit of their energy on it. And so then again it becomes a kind of strategy thing, like how can, if I want to see this type of thing or this type of presence or these types of ideas happen, I have to kind of work to inspire people, or teach them how they can do this kind of thing themselves. And because a lot of people are very motivated once you show them something cool, but then they don't necessarily feel the agency to be able to do this unless you present them exactly how they can do this in fun, accessible ways. And so for me, like something like this whole conference is like, wow, I think that making electronics that are interactive for nature, in nature, is a great idea. But I'm maybe like one of maybe a couple folks doing this. What can I do to get at least 100 people actively doing this right now? Okay, I can spend a little bit of my salary, rent out this place, invite a bunch of people to come. Done. That sounds great. And then I kind of like end up finding myself in these kind of like leadership positions. Like, I don't necessarily want the leadership position. I more so want to set up spaces of creativity or intensity that are accessible to people. I want to build this like cool, curious, amazing place that people can explore, but I don't necessarily want to really lead it. I more so just want to like plant this seed and let it kind of go wild, because I kind of then get a little itchy and I want to go and like do the next thing, or I want to play in the space too. So that gets, in terms of like the leadership stuff, that gets maybe a little bit tricky with me. I also think a lot of people think that I'm very sociable, and maybe I do this because I like all like the social stuff. But you know, sometimes I'll have like I'll even try to like, you know, sneak away a little bit, and more so work on my own things. Again, for me, it's more about setting up opportunities for people to learn and explore this stuff, rather than me telling them what to do or like holding their hands through the kind of thing. And that's what I really like. Yeah.
Great. How has making changed you?
my own particular type of making brings me out into the forest a lot. When I started my PhD, it was a very reverse engineered kind of thing. I had just come from doing my master's, where I was doing a lot of computer programming for making these apps to edit video with, and it just had me in front of a screen for so many days all the time. So before I did my PhD, I sat down with my advisor and I was basically like, look, if I'm going to do this, I need to engineer it so that it forces me to be outside and playing with nature and, with animals for a good amount of time. Like, I don't have an excuse. This is what I do. I have to go out there. And so it's changed me to almost have an excuse to be in nature a lot. And that's something that I love about it. And then it's also gotten me out there and like in fun, weird predicaments. Gotten horribly ill and stabbed with weird palm needles that were lodged in my legs for years and gave me recurring illnesses. But then it's also shown me amazing, beautiful places and exposed me to interesting cultures and ways of living and alternative modes of being employed or bonding with communities and people. And so, that's a lot of that's happened through being able to make stuff and share kinds of things. And in some ways it's a bit on kind of maybe like the cynical side. It's a bit, there's a big rush and lots of public support for different making things. And I didn't have much money, and a lot of what I did was try to find places where there would be support, and it'd be like, oh, there's a $5,000 grant for doing electronics projects here, and I'm like, I can figure out whatever electronics projects they need me to do. If it's going to send me down to Panama, that's great. And so in some ways it's kind of just riding these societal like kind of crazinesses for technology in general, and then trying to subvert that a little bit to get people to chill out a bit more and appreciate nature. So maybe that's one way I've changed making back from how it's changed me. I don't know.
Great. All right, last question.
Okay.
And it's a challenge question, but
okay.
I think you can do it. Tell me 10 things that you know better through making.
Okay. I know a very good idea of approximations of various types of ant weights, conductances, temperatures, sizes, anything to do with an ant from trying to actually sense a damn ant. So I've learned a lot about ants just through trying to make things that can sense these incredibly small, very lightweight kinds of things. So I've learned things about ants. I've learned how to solder quite well. I used to be terrible at soldering. I would just balls and they're just falling off, and then I after just brute forcing it, now I have this nice little teepees on all my header pins. Great. Soldering. Sewing. I'm going to say how to use a sewing machine, as well as a super good appreciation for textile crafts. I feel like people are all like, oh, digital technology is so amazing. There's all these new possibilities. I feel like we're still figuring out things that we can do just by twisting interesting textiles and stuff together. It's fascinating. That's, I think, my favorite new technology of the past 500 years is really sophisticated textile crafts, and even older. Yeah, it's awesome. So an appreciation for textiles, an appreciation for silicone. I've I didn't do much mold making before, but when I started making stuff, especially for my open source sex toy company, got really good at silicone and knowing different ways that you can use really high end silicone for things and ways that you can really twist and bend really low end, cheap, caulk silicone just to make stuff with and still get really high quality results. So that's 5, halfway through. I've learned extremely well how weather resistant lots of electronics are, and I've learned very well how to revive electronics that have been exposed to various different elements. Stuff growing in it, ant colonies moving into your Kindle, being completely waterlogged in a rainstorm. The only thing I haven't been able to figure out is saving something from a single dip in the ocean. That is a death sentence for any electronics. Once it's in the ocean, it's gone. But reviving stuff. This is good. I got 3 more. Glue sticking. Using glue sticks in various different ways that were not meant to be used. From lighters and pads to hook things up and to de-stress wires from getting pulled off of things, to using them as like light pipes and like pseudo fiber optics kinds of things. A lot of good stuff about glue sticks. Magnets, learned a lot about magnets and various strengths and brittlenesses of different magnets, ways that you can use them with other closure techniques to make really sophisticated, really nice, elegant feeling closures for things, as well as on-off permanent magnets, which I got to give a shout out to because I feel like not enough people know about these. There's permanent magnets you can just turn and they go from I'm really magnetic and to I'm completely not magnetic, and they don't use any electricity. They're awesome and very reliable. So I'm on to 9 with magnets, and then number 10. I'm going to say patience. Being able to be very patient when dealing with very frustrating things, even over long periods of time. Yeah, that's my 10.
Terrific.
Cool.
I will let you go with that one.
Okay.
Thank you so much. This has been a pleasure.